Prudence Ellery was a creature of ledgers and lists, her life measured in columns of ink and the quiet scratch of a nib on paper. She was 24 years old, and the most vibrant color in her world was the scarlet rule she drew to tally a final sum. The toast, when her Aunt Honora raised it, felt like a violation. "To my darling Flora," Honora Bellamy announced, her voice a confection of spun sugar and steel. "And to the match she is soon to make with Mr. Gideon Lockhart of Silverbeck." The half-dozen ladies assembled for tea murmured their approval. Prudence, seated at a small secretary desk by the window, did not look up. Her job was not to celebrate, but to ensure the celebration was paid for, its costs recorded, its debts settled. She was the engine of this household, unseen and unheard, and her fuel was competence. Flora, her cousin, was a vision in pale silks, her hair a marvel of blonde curls, her smile practiced to perfection. She blushed prettily, a skill Prudence had never mastered. "Oh, Mamma, you mustn't," she chided, though her eyes shone with triumph. Gideon Lockhart was the county's great prize, impossibly wealthy, owner of a dozen properties, and, tragically, fascinatingly widowed. He was a man of stone, people said, his heart buried with his late wife. A challenge. And the Bellamys loved nothing more than a challenge that promised profit. Prudence's pen continued its steady march across the page. The bill for the silks, the fee for the hairdresser, the cost of the French champagne for this very toast. It was all here, in her neat, precise hand. She had lived with her aunt and uncle since her parents' passing 10 years prior, a poor relation with a quick mind for figures. Honora had seen the utility in that. Prudence was not asked to dine with guests. She was tasked with ensuring the dinners ran flawlessly, and within a budget she was then scolded for adhering to. She was not a daughter. She was an asset, her invisible labor the foundation upon which Flora's social campaigns were built. She did not cry about it. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were an expenditure of emotion with no return on investment. A week later, the object of their ambitions arrived. Gideon Lockhart's carriage was a slash of severe black against the green drive of Bramblehurst Park. When he entered the drawing room, the air grew colder, quieter. He was tall, dressed in immaculate black broadcloth that seemed to absorb the light. His face was carved from granite, his eyes a startling pale gray, and they missed nothing. He moved with a stillness that was more commanding than any grand gesture. Honora and Flora fluttered around him, a storm of lace and flattery. Prudence, summoned to bring in a fresh pot of tea, moved through the room as she always did, a ghost in a plain gray dress. As she set the tray down, a gust of wind from an open window sent a stack of loose receipts skittering from her desk. One of them, a bill from the chandler, drifted and landed near Mr. Lockhart's gleaming black boot. Honora shot Prudence a look of pure venom. Flora giggled, a tinkling sound meant to dismiss the clumsiness. "Oh, do forgive my cousin," Flora said sweetly. "She is always buried in her papers." Prudence felt a familiar, dull flush of humiliation, but her face remained impassive. She knelt to retrieve the scattered slips. As her fingers closed around the one by his boot, his voice, low and devoid of warmth, stopped her. "Leave it." He bent, not with a courtly flourish, but with an abrupt, economical movement, and picked it up himself. His gaze did not fall on her face, but on the paper in his hand. He read the neat figures, the notation at the bottom. Overcharged by 2 shillings on the beeswax. Rectified. His pale eyes lifted and, for the first time, met hers. It was not a look of pity or amusement or even acknowledgement of her as a woman. It was a look of assessment. It was the look a man gives a tool when he is trying to discern its function. He held the receipt out to her. His fingers did not brush hers. The exchange was as sterile as a banker's. He stayed for precisely 1 hour. He spoke little, his responses to Honora's effusive chatter clipped and direct. He watched Flora play a frantic, error-filled piece on the pianoforte with an unreadable expression. As he was preparing to leave, he turned not to Honora or Flora, but to the corner, where Prudence was already back at her desk, sorting the rescued receipts. "Miss Ellery," he said. The use of her name was so unexpected, it was like a sudden sound in a silent room. Prudence rose. "Mr. Lockhart?" "My steward has been taken ill," he stated, as if discussing the weather. "My accounts for the northern properties are in disarray. I require someone to put them in order. Your aunt informs me you are capable in this regard." Honora beamed. "Oh, Prudence is a positive marvel with numbers. A family trait, you see. She would be delighted to assist, of course. A great honor." She was already calculating the fee she would charge for loaning out her niece's services. Gideon's gaze remained on Prudence. "I do not require assistance. I require a wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Flora's pretty smile froze and cracked. Honora's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Prudence's own heart gave a painful, singular thud. "A wife," he repeated, his tone unchanged. "I have no need for sentiment or society. My late wife, as you know, was the soul of my houses. They are now hollow. I require a mistress for my most remote estate, Withercombe. It is in a state of profound neglect. It needs management, a firm, intelligent hand. It needs someone who understands that sentiment is a luxury and order is a necessity. Someone who can rectify an overcharge of 2 shillings. He glanced at the desk, then back at her. "I am told it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. My truth is different. I am a man in possession of a great chaos, and I am in want of an administrator. The position comes with my name and my protection. It is a permanent post." He was not proposing marriage. He was offering a job. The most bizarre, humiliating, and strangely liberating job offer she had ever received. "Flora is the one," Honora began, her voice strangled. "Miss Bellamy is a decorative creature," Gideon said, the words falling like chips of ice. "Withercombe would break her in a week. I require substance, not ornament." His eyes, cold and clear, were locked on Prudence. "Well, Miss Ellery, you are a woman of figures. I imagine you can calculate the benefits and the costs. It is a plain offer. I require a plain answer." Prudence looked at her aunt's apoplectic face, at her cousin's crumbling expression of disbelief and fury. She looked at her little desk, at the endless columns of figures that represented her life, a life in service to others, a life of being invisible. Gideon Lockhart was offering her a different kind of invisibility, an exile. But it would be her own. Withercombe. She had heard of it. A ruin in the moors, with a road so bad no carriage had reached it in years. A prison. Or a kingdom. Her voice, when she found it, was as steady as the hand that held her pen. "Yes, Mr. Lockhart," she said. "I accept your position." The wedding was a transaction, as cold and swift as the signing of a deed. It took place in a dusty solicitor's office in the town of Marley, with Honora and a fuming Flora as reluctant witnesses. Prudence wore her best gray dress. Gideon wore his customary black. The vows were exchanged with the same emotional weight as the reading of a contract. When the solicitor pronounced them man and wife, Gideon did not kiss her. He simply inclined his head, a fractional movement. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, the name sounding foreign and heavy. Outside, her aunt cornered her, while Gideon finalized the paperwork. "You conniving little snake," Honora hissed, her face mottled with rage. "You did this deliberately. You stole this from my Flora." "I stole nothing, Aunt," Prudence replied, her voice quiet. "Mr. Lockhart made an offer. I accepted it." "He will tire of you. A plain, bookish creature like you, buried in that ruin. He will come to his senses and remember what a true lady is, and you will be left with nothing but mud and sheep." Prudence did not answer. She watched as Gideon emerged from the office and walked towards his waiting carriage. He did not look at her, but he paused, waiting. It was time to go. She turned away from Honora Bellamy, from the only life she had ever known, and did not look back. The journey to Withercombe was a descent into isolation. They left the manicured roads of the lowlands behind, climbing into a landscape of wind-scoured hills and vast, empty skies. The carriage rocked and swayed on a track that was little more than two muddy ruts. Heather, brown and brittle, clawed at the sides of the coach. Gideon sat opposite her, silent, his gaze fixed on the desolate scenery. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since the ceremony. "The road is poor," he stated, breaking the long silence. "It has been impassable for 5 years. We will go as far as the carriage can manage, then transfer to a cart." "I see," Prudence said. "Withercombe was my grandmother's house," he continued, his voice flat, stripped of nostalgia. "She loved it. After her death, it fell into disuse. My late wife, she did not care for such wild places. It has had no mistress for 20 years, no master to speak of. It has been left to the wind and the damp." He was setting expectations. He was warning her. She appreciated the honesty. It was more than she had ever received from her own family. The carriage lurched to a halt at a dilapidated stone bridge over a rushing peat-brown stream. Waiting for them was a farmer with a sturdy-looking wooden cart pulled by a thick-set pony. A man named Perkin, with a face like a weathered walnut, touched his cap. "Mr. Lockhart, ma'am." Their trunks were transferred. Prudence, holding her skirts, climbed onto the hard wooden bench of the cart. The ride was jarring, each rut and rock a shock that traveled up her spine. The air grew colder, smelling of wet earth and something else, something ancient and wild. After another hour, they crested a hill, and he pointed. "There, Withercombe." It was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape. A long, low manor of dark gray stone hunkered down against the wind. Many of its windows were boarded up. Slate tiles were missing from the roof like lost teeth. A few skeletal trees clawed at the sky beside it. There was no smoke from its chimneys. It looked as cold and as silent as her new husband. "I will stay 2 nights," Gideon said, as if sensing her thoughts, "to ensure you are settled with the housekeeper and have what you need to begin. Then I return to Silverbeck. I will provide you with a generous budget, deposited monthly in an account in your name in Marley. You will send me a report
with accounts on the first of every month. You are not to overspend, but you are not to let the house fall further into ruin. Your task is to halt the decay. Nothing more is expected. And if I need to communicate with you outside of the monthly report? She asked. The postboy comes to the village of Dunsmuir, 3 miles away, twice a week. Perkin will take the mail, but I expect you will have little cause to write. He was giving her a fortress and locking the gate from the outside. As they drew into the cobbled courtyard, the great oak door of the manor creaked open. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was tall and severe, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. She wore a black dress, stark and unforgiving.
"This is Hannah," Gideon said. "She was my grandmother's personal maid. She has refused to leave Withercombe." Hannah curtsied, a stiff, grudging movement. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over Prudence, taking in the plain dress, the steady hands, the unadorned face. There was no welcome in them. There was only skepticism, deep and abiding as the stone of the house itself. Gideon led Prudence inside. The air in the great hall was tomb-cold and smelled of dust and damp stone. Furniture huddled under white dust cloths like a congregation of ghosts. Her footsteps echoed on the flagstones. "Welcome to Withercombe, Mrs. Lockhart," Gideon said, the words utterly devoid of welcome. "Your duties begin now." Prudence stood in the center of the echoing hall, the chill seeping through the soles of her shoes. Her husband had given her a ruin. Her aunt had predicted her failure. The sole servant looked at her as if she were an insect to be brushed away. She thought of the endless ledgers, the thankless tasks, the years of being invisible. This was different. The dust was hers to command. The silence was hers to fill. The decay was hers to fight. She would not be defeated by dust and shadows. She took a slow, deep breath of the cold, damp air. It was the first breath she had ever taken that felt entirely her own. The first week was a battle of attrition fought against the house itself. Prudence rose before dawn each day, her breath pluming in the frigid air of her bedroom. The vast canopied bed was an island in a sea of cold, the water in the porcelain jug frozen solid each morning. Gideon had departed as promised, a silent figure on horseback disappearing into the mist, leaving her with a set of keys and a book of old household accounts. His final words to her were, "Do not fail." It was not a threat, but a simple statement of expectation. Her first act was not to command, but to work. She found the kitchens, a cavernous, stone-flagged space where Hannah was stoking a sullen fire in a huge range. The old housekeeper looked up, her expression unchanging. "Good morning, Hannah," Prudence said. "I will need a full inventory of all the household stores, larders, cellars, and pantries." "There's little to inventory, ma'am," Hannah said, her voice raspy. "We have oatmeal, salted pork, flour, and what's left of the root cellar. Enough for one, not for running a house." "Then we shall make a list of what is required," Prudence said calmly. "And while we do, we will begin cleaning this kitchen. The heart of a house must beat, and this one is still." Hannah's expression flickered with something, surprise perhaps. She had expected orders, not the offer of shared labor. Prudence tied on an apron she found in a drawer and began with the great wooden table, scrubbing away years of grime until the pale grain of the wood began to show through. For 2 days they worked in near silence, a silent compact forming between them.
Prudence did not shy away from the filthiest tasks. She cleaned grates, scoured pots, and organized shelves. By the third day, Hannah began to talk, her words clipped at first, then flowing into stories of the house as it once was. The old mistress, Mr. Gideon's grandmother. She loved this place, Hannah said, polishing a copper pan until it shone like a new coin. Said the air was honest. No place for lies up here, she'd say. The wind blows them all away. Prudence learned that the house had its own ecosystem. Perkin, the farmer, was their lifeline to the outside world, bringing supplies from Marley once a week. The villagers in Dunsmuir regarded Withercombe as a haunted place, a monument to the Lockhart's grief. Gideon had not visited in years, not since his first wife had declared it barbaric and refused to set foot in it. Her second front was the books. In the library, a magnificent two-story room thick with the scent of decaying paper, she found the estate ledgers going back 50 years. They were a disaster.
Bills unpaid, rents uncollected from the few tenant farmers, repairs neglected until they became structural failures. This was a language she understood. She set up a small table by the tall, unboarded window that looked out onto what was once a garden, and began her true work. She created a new ledger. On one side, the funds Gideon had provided. On the other, a meticulous list of expenditures, prioritized. First, food and firewood. Second, wages for a small staff she intended to hire from the village. Third, essential repairs, the roof, the windows. She worked for hours each day, the only sounds the scratch of her pen and the sighing of the wind. It was during this work that she found the first clue to Withercombe's hidden potential. Tucked inside an old almanac was a small, leather-bound journal. It was a garden diary kept by Gideon's grandmother, Leonora Lockhart. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, but the notes were practical, almost scientific. She described soil compositions, rainfall, and planting schedules. And she wrote, with passionate detail, about her roses. One in particular, Rosa Reginae Deliciae, or the Queen's Blush. A difficult but rewarding bloom, Leonora had written. The petals are the palest ivory at the edge, deepening to a true, tender blush at the heart. The scent is unlike any other. Her Majesty was so taken with the bouquet I brought to court, she declared it the delight of queens. A fragile thing. It requires the sharp, clean air of Withercombe to achieve its true colour. It will not suffer the cloying humidity of the south. Prudence looked out the window at the garden. It was a ruin of tangled thorns, collapsed trellises, and knee-high weeds. But against the far wall, choked by brambles, was a gnarled and ancient-looking rosebush, stubbornly clinging to life. That afternoon, she put on a pair of thick leather work gloves she'd found in the potting shed and went into the garden. Hannah watched her from the kitchen window, her face a mask of disbelief. Prudence began to clear the weeds around the old bush. The work was hard, her back ached, and thorns tore at her sleeves. But as she cleared the suffocating growth, she felt a sense of purpose that even the ledgers could not provide. She was not just halting decay, she was nurturing life. By the end of the month, the change in Withercombe was subtle but profound. There was smoke rising from more than one chimney. The great hall was clean, the dust cloths gone, the furniture polished and arranged. 2 young women from Dunsmuir, Bess and Tilly, now came up to help 3 days a week, their wages paid promptly by Prudence. The kitchen was a warm, bustling hub, filled with the smell of baking bread. And in the garden, the old rosebush, pruned and fed according to Leonora Lockhart's instructions, was showing the first hints of new, green shoots. Prudence wrote her first report to Gideon. It was 4 pages long. The first 2 pages were a summary of the accounts: funds received, funds expended, with categories for household, wages, and repairs. The second 2 pages were a proposal. She detailed the state of the tenant farms and the necessary investment to make them profitable again. She outlined a plan for the full restoration of the garden, citing its potential to supply the house and perhaps even sell produce in Marley. She did not mention the Queen's blush rose. That felt like a secret, a private hope. She ended the report with a simple, "Respectfully submitted, Prudence Lockhart." She sent it with Perkin and waited. A week later, he returned with a letter. Gideon's handwriting was black and severe, like the man himself. "Mrs. Lockhart, report received. The accounts are satisfactory. Your proposal regarding the tenant farms is sound. You may proceed. The garden is a frivolous expense, but as it appears to fall within your budget, I will not forbid it. Ensure the next report is equally thorough. G. Lockhart."
It was the coldest, most unfeeling letter she had ever received. And it made her want to smile. He had read it. He had considered her plans. He had called her proposal sound. For Prudence, who had spent a lifetime being dismissed, it was a roar of approval. That evening, Hannah brought a cup of hot, spiced cider to her desk in the library. She hadn't asked for it. "You've put a bit of warmth back in the old stones, ma'am," the housekeeper said, her voice softer than Prudence had ever heard it. "It's good to see." Prudence looked from the neat columns of her ledger to the dark window, where she could just make out the shape of the sleeping garden. Warmth. It was a start. The seasons turned. Spring breathed a soft green life back into the moors. At Withercombe, the change was more dramatic. Under Prudence's steady management, the house was stirring from its long slumber. A slater from Marley spent a month on the roof, his hammering a cheerful, rhythmic heartbeat against the silence. New glass was put in the broken windows, letting in streams of pale, northern light. The tenant farmers, paid a fair price for their labor in repairing their own cottages and fences, began to look at the new mistress of Withercombe with respect instead of suspicion. The garden was Prudence's sanctuary. Following the instructions in Leonora's journal, she had restored the old structure of the beds, planted vegetables, and nurtured the rescued herbs. And she tended to the Queen's blush rose with a devotion that was almost reverent. In late May, the first buds appeared, tight and green. By mid-June, they began to open. They were exactly as Leonora had described, ivory at the edges, with a deepening, heartbreakingly lovely pink at the center. The fragrance was exquisite, a clean, sweet scent that seemed to be the very essence of the moorland air. Prudence would often stand by the bush in the early morning just to breathe it in. It felt like a reward for all her quiet, patient work. Her monthly reports to Gideon grew more detailed. She now included updates on crop yields, milk production from the newly acquired cow, and the steady, measurable progress of the restoration. His replies remained clipped, but they began to include questions. Explain the discrepancy in the cost of lime mortar between this month and last. The yield from the north field seems low. What is the soil condition? He was reading every line. He was engaged, in his own remote, detached way. She found herself looking forward to his letters, to the challenge of his sharp, analytical mind. But as Withercombe bloomed, so did the resentment of those she had left behind. In Marley and in the drawing rooms of the county, a different story was being told. Arabella Sinclair, The beautiful woman who had believed herself the destined bride of Gideon Lockhart had not forgiven the slight. With Honora Bellamy as her eager accomplice, she began to sow seeds of a different kind. "I hear she's gone mad with loneliness up there," Arabella would say at tea parties, her voice laced with false pity. "Poor Gideon. He's too honorable to admit his mistake. They say she's squandering his fortune on that ruin, trying to turn it into some sort of palace. A hopeless endeavor." Honora would nod sagely. "The girl was always odd. No social graces, all head and no heart. She was never meant to be the mistress of a great house. She's a clerk, and now she's playing at being a lady, with disastrous results, I hear." Their whispers were like a creeping blight. At first, they were just words. But Arabella was not content with gossip. She wanted Gideon's attention back, and to get it, she needed to prove that he had made a catastrophic error. She needed to destroy Prudence. The plan was hatched over tea in Honora's drawing room, the very room where Prudence had once toiled in obscurity. "He values evidence, doesn't he?" Arabella mused, tapping a manicured finger against her lips.
He married her because he saw a notation on a receipt. He is a man of ledgers and facts, so we must give him a fact, something he cannot ignore. Honora, whose own finances had become considerably more strained without Prudence's unpaid management, was eager to help. "Forgery," she whispered, her eyes gleaming. "Proof," Arabella corrected her. "Proof that his little bookkeeper is a thief." They found their weapon in a disgruntled art dealer from whom Gideon's father had once purchased a set of valuable Flemish tapestries. The dealer believed he had been underpaid and held a grudge against the Lockhart family. For a price, he was willing to help. He procured a sheet of paper with the Withercombe letterhead left over from years before. He then helped them draft a letter, supposedly from Prudence to a clandestine buyer in London. The letter offered to sell one of the famous Withercombe tapestries, which were, in fact, hanging safely in the restored dining hall for a fraction of its value, with the money to be sent to a private account. To make it perfect, they needed her signature. Honora provided it, carefully tracing it from one of Prudence's old household lists. The result was a near-perfect imitation of Prudence's clear, precise hand. They sent the forged letter not to the fictional buyer, but to Gideon Lockhart at Silverbeck, enclosed in a plain envelope with a short, anonymous note. "You should know what your wife does in your absence." Arabella pictured the scene. Gideon receiving the letter, the cold fury in his eyes, his trust in his clever little wife shattering like glass. He would ride to Withercombe, not with questions, but with accusations. He would cast her out, and Arabella would be there to comfort him, to show him what a true, loyal lady was. The plan was flawless. It was a piece of evidence, and Gideon Lockhart, she knew, was a man who always trusted the evidence. The letter arrived at Silverbeck on a Tuesday. Gideon was in his study, a room as severe and orderly as himself, when his butler brought it in on a silver tray. He slit the envelope with a letter opener, his movements economical and precise. He read the anonymous note first, his expression unchanging. Then he unfolded the forged letter. He read it once, twice. The handwriting was uncannily familiar. The cold, business-like tone proposing the secret sale, the betrayal cloaked in the language of commerce, it struck a chord of old, bitter pain. His first marriage had ended not just in grief, but in betrayal. His beautiful, vivacious wife had been secretly running up enormous debts, her laughter and affection a cover for a deep-seated deceit he had only discovered after her death. He had sworn then never to be fooled by a surface again, to trust only what was plain, what was proven. And here was proof. The calm, competent woman he had married, the woman whose reports were models of clarity and order, was a thief. The quiet satisfaction he had begun to take in her transformation of Withercombe curdled into ashes in his mouth. He had allowed himself a flicker of something akin to admiration, a sliver of trust. He had been a fool. Again. He did not shout. He did not smash anything. His face became a mask of ice. He stood up, walked to the bell pull, and summoned his groom. "Saddle my horse," he said, his voice quiet and deadly. "I ride for Withercombe immediately." He rode through the day and into the evening, not sparing his horse. The landscape blurred past him, a gray-green smear of resentment and fury. He had offered her his name, his protection, a kingdom of her own. In return, she had treated him like a fool, stealing from him under the guise of meticulous management. The garden, the repairs, the reports, it was all a clever facade, a screen for her avarice. Honora Bellamy's parting words to him after the wedding echoed in his mind. "The girl has a head for figures, Mr. Lockhart. Be sure you know which side of the ledger she is on." He arrived at Withercombe as dusk was bleeding into night. The house was no longer a dark wound in the landscape. Lights glowed in half a dozen windows, warm and golden. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney, a beacon of domesticity. The sight of it, the evidence of her success, only fueled his rage. It was a lie, all of it. He strode to the great oak door and threw it open without knocking. Prudence was in the hall, lighting a candle on a side table. She turned, her face calm, a small, welcoming smile just touching her lips as she saw him. "Gideon," she said, the use of his first name still new and tentative between them. "I was not expecting you. Is everything all right?" Her composure was the final insult. He strode towards her, his boots loud on the stone flags. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from him. He held out the forged letter. "Explain this," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. Prudence took the letter. Her eyes scanned the page. She saw the familiar letterhead, the imitation of her own hand, the damning words. Her small smile vanished. The color drained from her face, but her expression did not crumble. There were no tears, no protestations of innocence. She simply stood there, reading the accusation, her stillness a stark contrast to the violent turmoil in his chest. She looked up from the letter, and her eyes, clear and direct, met his. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Is it?" he sneered, the sound ugly in the quiet hall. "The handwriting is yours. The sentiment, selling off my property for your own gain, seems plausible enough for a woman who married a man she did not know for his fortune." The cruelty of his words hung in the air between them. He wanted to wound her, to see her break, but she did not. Her chin lifted a fraction. "You are mistaken. I did not marry you for your fortune. I married you for my freedom. There is a difference." She held the forged letter out to him. "The person who wrote this does not know me, and it seems neither do you." Her quiet dignity was more infuriating than any denial. "Do not play games with me, Prudence. I have the evidence in my hand." "No," she corrected him, her voice still unnervingly calm. "You have a piece of paper. The evidence is in the library." She turned and walked towards the library door, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She did not look to see if he was following. She simply expected him to. After a moment's hesitation, his jaw tight with fury, he followed. The library was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth. A lamp cast a golden glow over her desk. It was an oasis of order and peace, and the sight of it grated on his raw nerves. She did not speak. She went to her desk, took out a key, and unlocked a drawer. From it, she removed her household ledger. She opened it on the desk, the pages filled with her neat, precise script. Then she went to a shelf and took down a large portfolio. She placed it beside the ledger. "The evidence," she said again, her voice quiet but resonant in the book-lined room. She opened the portfolio. Inside were sketches, detailed architectural drawings of every room in the manor, and with each drawing was an inventory. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every rug, and every tapestry was listed, its condition noted, its location marked. On the page for the dining hall, she pointed to a specific entry. Set of 4 Flemish tapestries. Subject, the 4 seasons. Condition, good, minor fraying on the border of winter. Cleaned and rehung, May. Then she turned to the ledger. She flipped through the pages to the expenses for May. "Here," she said, pointing to a line item. "Wages for Bess and Tilly, 4 days' work cleaning tapestries." She then pointed to another entry. "Purchase of 3 spools of wool thread, matching colors, for minor repairs to tapestry borders." She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. "The tapestries are in the dining hall. They have not been sold. They have been cleaned and repaired. The cost is recorded here. The evidence, Mr. Lockhart, has been in your hands every month for the past year. You simply chose not to believe it." He stood frozen, the forged letter a flimsy, poisonous thing in his hand. He looked from the meticulous inventory to the flawless accounts. He saw the cross-referenced entries, the receipts she had neatly filed, the entire irrefutable architecture of her honesty. It was all here. A fortress of truth, built line by line, day by day. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a cold, sickening shame. He had been so ready to believe the worst, so quick to let the ghosts of his past poison his present. He had looked at this woman, who had done nothing but bring order and life to his chaos, and he had accused her of the basest betrayal. He looked at her face, pale in the lamplight but resolute. She was not angry. She was not triumphant. She was simply waiting. Waiting for him to see the truth that had been in front of him all along. "Who?" he asked, his voice rough. "Who would do this?" "Someone who believes you are a man who trusts a single, sensational lie over a year of quiet, consistent truth," she said. "Someone who wanted you to come here, just like this. Someone who wanted you to destroy what I have built." She paused, then added with devastating simplicity, "They almost succeeded." The weight of his own monstrous failure settled on him. He had not just doubted her. He had joined her enemies. He had become the very weapon they sought to use against her. He looked at the forged letter, then at her steady, clear eyes, and for the first time, he understood. It was not her integrity that had been tested. It was his, and he had failed. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The days that followed were filled with a strained, fragile silence. Gideon did not leave. He stayed at Withercombe, a ghost in his own house, watching his wife from a distance. He saw her directing the staff with quiet authority, walking in the garden she had brought back to life, spending her evenings at her desk in the library. She did not avoid him, but she did not seek him out. She treated him with a cool, distant courtesy that was more damning than any argument. She was waiting. He knew not for what. An apology seemed insultingly inadequate. He spent his time reading. He went through every one of her monthly reports, every ledger, every receipt. He walked the grounds, noting the repaired fences, the healthy livestock, the cleared drainage ditches. He saw the respect in the eyes of the tenant farmers when they spoke to her. He saw the loyalty of Hannah, Bess, and Tilly. He had given her a ruin and commanded her to halt its decay. Instead, she had resurrected it. One afternoon, he found her in the garden, standing before the magnificent rose bush. It was heavy with blooms, the queen's blush roses scenting the air. She was holding a single, perfect flower in her hand, her expression one of quiet contemplation. "It is from this bush," she said, without turning to look at him. "The one my aunt and her friend used to build their lie." He had pieced it together. The animosity from Honora, the jealousy of Arabella Sinclair. It had their fingerprints all over it. "They will be held accountable," he said, his voice hard. Prudence finally turned to face him. "Will they? And how will you do that, Gideon? By showing them the ledgers? By proving I am a competent administrator? That is not what they attacked. They attacked my character. They attacked your judgment. They sought to prove I was unworthy of the name Lockhart. Your name." She was right. A private confrontation, a solicitor's letter. It would do nothing. The poison was public, whispered in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. The antidote had to be public too. But how? The answer arrived, unexpectedly, with Perkin the farmer, in the form of a letter bearing a royal seal. Prudence opened it, her hands perfectly steady. She read it, and a slow flush rose in her cheeks. She handed it to Gideon. The letter was from the Queen's private secretary. It seemed that a member of the Royal Botanical Society, an old correspondent of Leonora Lockhart, had received a pressed bloom of a Rosa Reginae Delicii from Withercombe. The specimen was so perfect, so vibrant, it had caused a sensation. The Queen, upon hearing that her grandmother's favorite rose had been brought back from the brink of extinction, had expressed a desire to see the garden and meet the woman responsible for its revival. Her Majesty would be in the county in a fortnight and proposed to make an informal visit to Withercombe. Gideon stared at the letter. The Queen, coming here, to this remote, inaccessible manor. "The road," he began. "Is repaired," Prudence finished for him. "The last section was completed a week ago. I used the profits from the sale of the excess wool and cheese. It is in the accounts." Of course it was. An idea began to form in Gideon's mind, a plan as audacious as it was terrifying. A public reckoning. He looked at Prudence, at the quiet strength in her face. "They wanted to prove you were unworthy of the name Lockhart," he said slowly. "Instead, you have brought royalty to our door." He met her gaze. "Let them come. Let them all come." The news spread through the county like wildfire. The Queen was visiting Withercombe. The initial disbelief gave way to a frenzy of speculation. Withercombe, that forgotten ruin. Visiting that plain, peculiar wife of Gideon Lockhart's. It was unthinkable. Arabella Sinclair and Honora Bellamy were aghast. Their plan had been to isolate and discredit Prudence, not to make her the object of royal favor. "It must be a trick," Arabella insisted, pacing Honora's drawing room. "She has somehow deceived the palace. When the Queen arrives and sees that hovel, the truth will come out. We must be there to witness it, to help the Queen understand the true situation." Honora agreed. It was their chance to expose Prudence once and for all, on the grandest possible stage. They would present themselves at Withercombe on the day of the visit, ostensibly to pay their respects to Her Majesty, but truly to deliver the killing blow. On the appointed day, Withercombe was transformed. The house stood proud and clean, its windows gleaming. The garden was a jewel box of color and life. Hannah, Bess, and Tilly moved with quiet efficiency, their faces shining with pride. Prudence wore a simple but elegant dress of deep blue velvet, the color of the moorland sky at twilight. She looked not like a clerk, but like the mistress of the house, calm and composed. Gideon stood beside her in the courtyard. He had sent 2 invitations, one to his solicitor and one to Lord Ashworth, the Lord Lieutenant of the county, a man whose integrity was beyond reproach. They both arrived early, their expressions curious. Just before noon, 2 carriages appeared on the horizon, traveling smoothly along the newly repaired road. The first was the grand, ostentatious carriage of Arabella Sinclair. She and Honora alighted, dressed in their finest, their faces masks of sweet concern. "My dear Prudence," Honora gushed. "And Gideon, we heard the wonderful, if surprising, news. We came at once to offer our support. A royal visit can be so overwhelming, especially in such rustic conditions." "We are managing, thank you," Prudence said coolly. Arabella's eyes swept the courtyard, the clean facade of the house. A flicker of doubt crossed her face before she concealed it. "You have made some improvements. How resourceful." "One does wonder what it must have cost." Before Gideon could respond, the second carriage arrived. It was black, elegant, and bore the royal coat of arms. The world seemed to hold its breath as the footman opened the door. The Queen emerged, a small, formidable woman with eyes that missed nothing. Prudence curtsied low. Gideon bowed. The Queen's gaze passed over them and settled on the house. "So," she said, her voice crisp, "Withercombe lives again. And you must be the woman who listens to old roses." She smiled, a brief, genuine flash of warmth. She looked at Prudence not as a subject, but as a fellow gardener. As Prudence began to lead Her Majesty towards the garden path, Arabella stepped forward. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying deeply. "Forgive this intrusion, but as loyal subjects, we feel it is our duty to prevent you from being deceived." The Queen turned her sharp eyes on Arabella. "Deceived? Explain yourself, Miss Sinclair." "This woman," Arabella said, pointing a dramatic finger at Prudence, "is not what she seems. She has taken advantage of my dear friend Mr. Lockhart's grief and trust. She has been systematically stealing from this estate, selling its treasures to fund her own ambitions. We have proof." Lord Ashworth stepped forward, his face grave. Gideon remained perfectly still, watching Prudence. This was her moment. Prudence did not look at Arabella. She addressed the Queen. "Your Majesty, Miss Sinclair is referring to a letter she and Mrs. Bellamy forged, purporting to show me selling a tapestry." She turned to Gideon's solicitor. "Mr. Davies, if you would." The solicitor stepped forward and presented the forged letter to Lord Ashworth. "And this," Prudence continued, her voice clear and steady, "is the household ledger for the past year, and the inventory of the house. You will find the tapestry in question is not sold, but was cleaned and repaired in May, at a cost of 12 shillings. She handed the ledger and the inventory to the Lord Lieutenant. He examined the documents, his eyebrows rising. He walked to the dining room window and peered inside. He came back, his face like thunder. The tapestries are there. The books are immaculate. This letter, he held up the forgery with distaste, is a malicious falsehood. The Queen's gaze, now glacial, fell upon Arabella and Honora. Some people, she said, her voice cutting through the silence, choose to cultivate gardens. Others, it seems, cultivate only weeds and slander. I find I have no time for the latter. She turned her back on them completely, a dismissal more brutal than any command. Now, Mrs. Lockhart, she said to Prudence, her voice warm again. Show me my rose. Honora and Arabella stood frozen, exposed and humiliated before the highest authority in the land. Their social ruin was absolute and public. They stumbled back to their carriage and fled, their departure a cloud of dust and shame. The rest of the visit was a quiet triumph. The Queen walked through the garden, listened as Prudence explained the restoration, and accepted a single, perfect Queen's blush bloom with genuine delight. Before she left, she turned to Gideon. You are a fortunate man, Mr. Lockhart, she said. You have a wife of rare substance. See that you deserve her. As the Queen's carriage disappeared down the road, a profound quiet settled over Withercombe. The solicitor and the Lord Lieutenant departed, their expressions full of a newfound respect for the mistress of the house. Gideon and Prudence were left alone in the courtyard, the scent of roses hanging in the afternoon air. He turned to her, his heart full of a feeling he could not name. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was a deep, soul-shaking love. He had seen her face down her enemies, not with hysterics or accusations, but with the quiet, unassailable power of her own competence and integrity. She had not needed him to rescue her. She had rescued herself, and in doing so, had rescued him from his own cynical darkness. I have been a fool, he said, his voice raw. It was a difficult position, she answered, her forgiveness as simple and profound as everything else she did. He took a step closer, taking her hands in his. They were not soft, ladylike hands. They were capable, strong, the hands that had brought his house and his heart back to life. I offered you a prison, he said. You made it a sanctuary. I asked for a manager. I find I need a wife. He went down on one knee, there on the hard stones of the courtyard, before his quiet, magnificent wife. My wife, Prudence, if you will have me, truly have me. Her eyes, which he had once thought plain, were luminous. He saw a glimmer in them, not of tears, but of a deep, radiant joy. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she smiled, a true, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. Yes, Gideon, she said softly. Plainly, yes. 2 years later, the sound of a child's laughter echoed in the gardens of Withercombe. A little boy, with his father's pale gray eyes and his mother's determined spirit, chased a butterfly through the flower beds. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the warmth of a family, the bustle of a thriving estate, and the quiet contentment of a love built on a foundation of truth. Prudence and Gideon stood on the terrace, watching their son. The air was sweet with the scent of the Queen's blush roses, which now grew in glorious profusion along the old stone wall. Gideon reached out and took his wife's hand. He brought it to his lips, kissing the fingers that had once been stained with ink from other people's ledgers, and were now stained with good earth from her own garden. "Do you remember what you said when you accepted my first, wretched proposal?" he asked, his voice low. "I said I was accepting a position," she recalled, a smile playing on her lips. "And now?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze on the vibrant, living garden, the warm, breathing house, the laughing child. She looked at the man beside her, no longer a creature of stone, but a man of deep, quiet warmth. "Now," she said, her voice full of a peaceful certainty, "I am home." The single rose bush, once a forgotten relic, had become a forest of bloom. It was not just a symbol of what she had cultivated in the soil, but of the love she had cultivated in the heart of a broken man, and the life she had built, not from a contract, but from her own unwavering substance. She had been given a ruin, and from it, she had grown a world. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.